College football nerds here to talk Georgia Bulldogs, doing a little preview 2 weeks before the season. We wanted to get all our previews done early in the season to have them time to marinate, but COVID kind of threw a wrench in those things. Had entire conferences canceled, coming back, so we didn't know what was going on. We wanted to kind of let things settle down before we did any more previews. So now we're going to talk Georgia Bulldogs. Got Josh with me. Josh, for Georgia, I think we were talking before we hit record on this show, and one of the things that you brought up that I think is true every year, but it was really, really acute last year, was that defensively, Georgia really wasn't talked about. It was just assumed that they were good, and everybody wanted to talk about their struggles offensively, but that defense was so freaking good, and it never came up. And I bring it up now because a lot of people just want to talk about Jamie Newman. A lot of people would want to just talk about them losing their quarterback this close to the season and how it's going to throw a wrench in everything and how they're going to struggle because they're already bad offensively, and now what are they doing with the quarterback? We're forgetting the fact that this is still that Georgia defense. And when you've got a defense that good, it's going to keep you in a game with any of the big boys. So unpack that a little bit and kind of get us into this Georgia discussion, kicking it off with something we know is good, and that's their defense.
And I do think they were kind of underrated defensively. I mean, everybody understood that Georgia had a really good defense, but they were the number one scoring defense. They were number one rushing defense. They were number 3 total defense in the country. They did play some pretty good teams. I know their schedule wasn't necessarily the absolute hardest in the SEC. I'm looking at you, South Carolina and A&M, with like hardest schedules in history, but it was still good. And they went in and handled business every stinking week. They went to Notre Dame. They gave up 17 points. They went to Tennessee. They gave up 14 points. Even South Carolina lost. It was double overtime, and they only gave up 20. So all season, it was a team that allowed over 20 points exactly once. That was the LSU game. And there were a lot of reasons for it. One is I think Kirby Smart is an exceptional defensive coach. I mean, his guys, everywhere he's ever been, play at a high level. They play at a high level consistently. He runs a good scheme. His players always know what they're supposed to be doing. They've recruited as well or better than anyone else in the country. I think really that defense starts inside out with Jordan Davis at the nose tackle position. Most people know him. I think nationally he's getting maybe more hype and more recognition, not necessarily by the media, but the general public. But in a 3-4, if you've got a guy that's a stud at that nose guard position, it kind of makes everything else flow. And then when you move back from there, I mean, you get guys like Nakobe Dean on the outside, and you got a whole bunch of guys that were number 1 recruits, edge rushers. You get guys like Tyson Campbell that was maybe as a freshman, he wasn't quite what you hoped for, and Stokes comes in, you solidify the position, and now Campbell's ready to come in as a sophomore, probably start and play at a high level. So, and I'm not even touching everything, right? I mean, there's like LeCount, there's Monty Rice, there's Malik Herring. I mean, there's all kinds of talent and quality, and they've got it, 3 levels deep defensively. So it's hard to say enough good things about Georgia's defense. I think everybody they play all year, they will have the ability to slow them down, the ability to beat everybody on their roster. It doesn't matter if you're playing Alabama. You played them a couple times in recent years, and did Georgia lose the game? They did. But defensively, they controlled those games for the most part for most of the game. So they're clearly capable of beating, I think, everybody in the country due to the just level of defensive quality they have.
I want to say we did a preview show, not really a preview show, but a discussion about how the Big Ten and the SEC are going to navigate this COVID world this season. Y'all check it out. I think it was a pretty good discussion. I want to talk about Georgia in the context of that a little bit. One of the things we said months ago was the teams that handle the disruption that COVID brings, who are equipped to do that the best, are the ones that are going to be the most successful, obviously. And it's not necessarily the most talented teams, the teams that recruit the best, but it's more on how incumbent are you at key positions like quarterback, and how little turnover did you have mainly, yes, in your two deep, but also in your coaching staff. So, given all of that, how much are you concerned about Georgia offensively needing to improve to be a championship team over last year? I think last year Georgia was a great team, a good to great team, but that's not going to cut it for Georgia right now, given their expectations. How concerned are you that just out of no fault of their own, COVID brings a complication to things that they're maybe ill-equipped to handle, given Newman leaving, and really he wasn't even an incumbent at Georgia, and given some of the turnover that they've had?
Again, it's totally different situations on both sides of the ball, right? It's your tale of two cities. I mean, your glittering tower of European elegance is your defense. You get, not only do you have a lot of guys coming back, you've got a lot of quality players. You've got guys like Nakobe Dean that are 5-star stepping in. You got guys like Nolan Smith that maybe are even role players, even though they're absolutely phenomenal talents. The defensive side of the ball, they're a lot better off than most teams. And I say that because most teams, I think, are going to end up in situations where they're going to have deficiencies. And I think sometimes people miss that. You can have a deficiency on offense and you just choose not to give that guy the ball. And maybe that lowers your ability to do offensive output, and maybe that creates problems for you. But you can, if you want to run the ball every play, you can, and you can just never throw it. And you're hurt because you're not throwing it, but your terrible passing game only comes into play if the run game doesn't work. Defensively, if you've got really bad corners or really bad linebackers or something, like Alabama the past couple of years has had bad linebackers, the whole defense can be shattered. They were really good in the secondary last year at Alabama, but the linebackers were not great. And teams could exploit that up and down the field all day. And because the offense dictates how the game is played. So I'm a little less concerned in that regard, but you still got to have something that works well. And I think the problem for Georgia is we were already in a situation where it was hard to identify, let me be clear, a proven area of production. In 2019, Georgia was 72nd in the country in passing offense. Now, the run game was good, but you were still 41st in the country in rushing yards per game. I know we're a yard per play team, but those numbers are still low enough that they're just not great in and of themselves. You take that roster and you lose, 3 starters from the offensive line. You lose your quarterback. You lose your starting running back. You lose a couple receivers. Blaylock now tears his ACL. There's a lot of issues on that side of the ball. And I know they've had a coordinator change, which I think in this case may be a good thing because they just haven't had good production from that coaching position. But there's a lot of roster turnover. The receivers we talked about a lot had not been very productive. Let me use the LSU game as an example. We talked about going in the conference championship game. We felt like Georgia would give LSU's offense more of a fight than anybody had. But our word of warning, and the reason we picked LSU, and we said that LSU would probably win by some margin, was pretty simple. Really elite offenses, it doesn't matter how good your defense is, in this era of football, in the RPO world, with a great quarterback, you're going to put up 30 points or more. And a great defense will keep them under 40, which is what we saw from Georgia. I mean, LSU ripped Oklahoma apart and then turned around and scored 42 on Clemson. Georgia's defense was better than Clemson's defense last year. But their offense was only good enough to put up, 10 points. So if that's where you're at offensively, you have issues. And they've got more turnover, and now you got the COVID situation. Newman opts out. JT Daniels comes in as a transfer. I'll be honest, I think there's a little bit, from things I've heard, I think Dwan Mathis is likely going to be your week 1 starter. So I think some of that's a little overplayed, but like JT Daniels to be honest, we're not super high on him coming out of USC. We've talked about it in the past regarding USC. We just don't think he was ready for the Pac-12. And if he wasn't ready there, hasn't played for a year, and is still at this point not medically cleared, I think it'll be a while before he could start, if he ever does. So, I mean, you mesh all those things together, and George Pickens is your one proven guy, and he's only going to carry you so far. So I do think this is a bad year for all these things to come into play, for all these offensive issues, because they're going to hold teams to low points. But I cannot reliably identify any part of the roster offensively that tells me they're going to score a lot of points. And that's a problem, given the schedule that they're about to face.
And the schedule is a good point. because we're talking about a lot of things that are really no fault of Georgia at all. I mean, Newman leaving isn't Georgia's fault, especially I imagine COVID had a lot to do with it, where this year a lot of players are just kind of taking this as this year is just not a real year. And it's wrecking coaching staff's ability to field a proper team. There's another thing that's really not their fault, but it's horrible timing, and that's their schedule. Yeah, they get the layup with Arkansas, but then they go Auburn, Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky, Florida all in a row. And Tennessee and Kentucky may not be elite teams. Auburn's not an elite offense, but we saw that Auburn game last year with Georgia. It was a dogfight because it's two great defenses. And when you have two great defenses and not great offenses, then both teams are going to be in the game. So they've got Auburn right off the bat, and then Tennessee and Alabama and Kentucky's not going to be a pushover, and then Florida. So I think that you could almost pivot this and move all those teams to the back end of the schedule, and the outcome for Georgia might be entirely different just because they need to get a quarterback, whomever it is, to get comfortable in the system, knock the rust off, and be ready to go in 2 weeks or in the second game. That's a lot to ask, which means there's a very good chance that they're going to lose one or two games that they really shouldn't lose, and they're really a better team than they are. We talked about this in our COVID discussion, and you can touch on it a little bit here, how we're going to have to forgive losses for a lot of teams because there are teams that are definitely going to lose early in the season because of rust issues, because there was no spring practice, because they don't know who should be starting. They haven't had enough practices to figure all that out. Could you see Georgia going 7-3 this year when if you reordered their schedule to backload it, they go 9-1?
I absolutely think that's a possibility. And we had mentioned in some of our other offseason content that we were starting to wonder if Florida wasn't going to be the team that won the East just due to schedule. And that was due to the old schedule. And now Georgia really got the short end of the stick. Florida plays Texas A&M and LSU. Georgia plays Auburn and Alabama. And I think that's the teams you didn't want to play. It may be that A&M is better than Auburn. A lot of people are high on A&M. I will say now, in this video, I don't think we'll do an A&M preview, but I am not as high on A&M. And I will say, if you're an A&M fan, you should probably anticipate with Osmond leaving that you're going to find out some other things are going on in your program that you're not going to be thrilled with the direction or basically how happy and cohesive your roster is going to be. I'll put it that way based off stuff I've heard. I don't think A&M is going to be what they're supposed to be this year. So with Georgia, with their schedule, they may end up, being a 3-loss team that's better than Florida. They may end up beating Florida, dropping 2 other games, and then, Florida's only losses to Georgia or something like that. That will not surprise me at all. So I think they're going to be better than their record. And unfortunately, how much they're going to improve in November, which I think is going to happen, isn't going to really help them from a win-loss perspective. They're going to beat Missouri, Mississippi State, South Carolina, and Vanderbilt. I think they're going to beat them unless something horribly goes wrong. But like we talked about, given where their offense is, there's going to be a game, I almost guarantee you, in these first 6 weeks of the season, there's going to be a game where the defense plays their hearts out and the offense just struggles to put up 13. And they're going to lose to some team that returns a punt for a touchdown and like a interception for a touchdown, never moves the ball an iota, and wins the game. That kind of game is probably going to happen to Georgia because of where their offense is, the shakeup they've had.
What happened last year with South Carolina?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm saying. But the problem is your South Carolina game that was early in the year last year, you've got as many items that create that recipe this season. And I know you may say, well, we've got a different coordinator. I was like, okay, you got a more proven quarterback. You had a much more proven run game last year too. And a coordinator is not going to magically make a quarterback good, which we just saw with FSU and Blackman, and they're not going to magically make that offensive line gel with very limited practice time, which is going to be a big deal for how they want to play football. So, a game like Tennessee, that you're a lot better than Tennessee, you still might lose that game just because Garantano can be a bit of a head case, and he's really inconsistent, but he can throw some occasional darts down the field, and they will score a couple touchdowns on people they really have no business scoring on because they've got some random talent on that roster that can hit a few big plays. And you're probably going to drop one of those this year. So it's Georgia to me, and you can almost hear the emotion in my voice. It's kind of frustrating to look at them because I think they're going to end the season as one of the best teams in the country. And I'm not sure that they're going to have the opportunity to show it. I mean, I think they may lose a few games. I think they may not end up in the East Championship. But, here's another thing. Let me turn it around to you. If they were to, let's say they drop 2 games this year and they go 8-2, let's assume the Big Ten, this is probably going to be outdated in 3 days. Who knows? But let's assume the Big Ten doesn't play. Or let's assume the Big Ten comes in, but everybody in the Big 12 just shoots themselves in the foot. Is it almost a good thing that they could lose the game to, maybe they lose to Florida early and that was their only loss. Florida loses one other game. Maybe they lose to LSU and Florida goes in and let's say they get crushed by Alabama. Is that the worst thing that maybe Georgia misses the SEC East Championship game? Because this year, more than any other, with a limited number of conferences, you have the opportunity to backdoor into the playoff discussion.
The problem with that, and I think in most cases, in most years, you could, because they'd have an opportunity to finish the season with an Auburn like next to last game of the year, and then a Georgia Tech where they can show that they can crush an out-of-conference opponent. But this year they end Mississippi State, South Carolina, and Vanderbilt. So if you drop one in that stretch that you shouldn't, and you drop one in that stretch that you should, it's not Georgia's fault, but nobody's going to be watching them play South Carolina on November 28th. They're just not. And I don't know who Alabama's playing and who's Florida's playing, but you can beat all the Vanderbilts and Mississippi States in the world that you want, but that's not going to erase the lasting impression of dropping a game to Kentucky that you shouldn't have. And so the other problem we have this year, and this is really something that nobody's thinking about because we're so used to that 10-win benchmark of really putting you in the discussion of other teams. Every loss this year is magnified because we only have 10 games. We don't have a 12 or 13 game schedule. So there's so little margin. It's kind of like a catch-22. Like, we want to forgive a loss, but there's also so little margin because you only have 10 games to work with. So it's a frustrating situation. I agree with you for Georgia because I do think that they might drop a game they shouldn't, and then come November, they are one of the best teams in the country because they've figured out at quarterback and offensive line, and they're gonna demolish a Baylor or some random team from another conference that had a quote unquote good year, but really was only good because they played the rest of their conference. So this is a preview. We generally do some kind of prediction for our previews. Give me a final regular season record prediction for Georgia this year.
I'm a little torn on it, but I'm going to go with 7-3, and I know that's a negative viewpoint. I think your number of wins to me is about 7.5 with Georgia, given the current situation. But with Auburn, Alabama, and Florida, I think they win one of those 3, and then they drop one other one they shouldn't, and it is due to the schedule and the situation. Let me get in one piece before I forget it. But like I talk about the quarterback situation, I think DeJuan Mathis, hopefully he's going to start because he's a surprise. But I'm really concerned because what I'd seen from JT Daniels, I watched a bunch of film, sort of expecting a certain situation to come into place. He was a turnover machine at USC, and the number of times he clearly predetermined his throw and threw into coverage. Like watching the Texas game and the UCLA game, even when he looked okay in terms of numbers, guys dropped 3 to 5 interceptions in those games. And he hasn't played since then. I don't see any way that Daniels is ready until the end of the season. And the only way I can see this going better for Georgia is if Mathis is just a huge breakout star. But my real concern is that they're in the situation by default that Mathis is the only guy ready to play. JD Daniels may actually still be the best quarterback, and it may simply be that he's not going to be medically cleared in time to practice and prepare. And again, even if he gets cleared, he hasn't played any contact practice in over a year at this point. So yeah, I'm gonna have to go with 7-3, and I think it's a shame. I think Newman leaving and everything else is just going to catch up to him, and given the schedule, there's not a lot more that can be done about it.
Yeah, and I'm going to go 8-2 because I think the flip side of this is I do think they lose a game they shouldn't to one of these teams that's not got a lot of pedigree. But I think they maybe win a game that they shouldn't early in the season, given their roster, because the other team they're facing is dealing with the same crap. I mean, we saw Auburn have to miss, I think you're saying, like a whole week of practice, didn't have a spring practice. And by the way, they got a crappy quarterback too. So I could see them, like, we're thinking, oh, crap, week 2, Auburn, and you're starting a green quarterback and all of this, but they might win that game 9-6, and then turn around and lose to Tennessee. So I think 8-2, and I hope that Georgia fans appreciate the fact that we don't just come in and try to win clicks, win shares by being just totally positive. We're not negative. We are just, and I hate when people say, well, I'm not an optimist or a pessimist, I'm a realist. We try to give the most candid view of a team we can and not color it with bias, and we don't hate Georgia or anything like that. But it would be better for our channel for us to just come in and say, Georgia's going to go 9-1, 10-0, their playoff standard. And we haven't done that in the past on Georgia, and we've gotten a lot of heat from them, but we've been right. So we hope that we've earned a little bit of love from Georgia fans to understand that when we're not saying what you want us to say, it's not because we hate your team. It's because that's just how we see it, and we could be wrong, and we'll own it if we are. So any other final words on Georgia before we close this one out?
Yeah, I think the final thing I would say on Georgia is, they're set up well for the future. I mean, defensively, that pipeline is still flowing. The recruiting classes are still ridiculously good. I mean, number 1 national rank coming in for this season's class. Things are going to eventually turn around, right? I mean, in the offensive situation, one way or the other is going to get kind of corrected. And I just think it's a bad year because your quarterback situation, which you stabilized, got destabilized. And this is the year where the run game was going to have to turn over. You didn't need both those things happen at the same time. And the one thing, no matter what, in every season that takes time to gel is a run game. And even like when Auburn, the couple times that they ran the gauntlet, 2010, 2013, they were not a great offense the first 4 games of the season, which everybody kind of forgets. That even the great ground attacks that have made playoff runs or national title runs, they usually take about 4 to 6 games to get rolling. And that's with spring practice. That's with a regular fall camp. This is not just a bad combination of events for Georgia. And you're still probably looking at a 7-win floor. So this is still an awesome football team with a tremendous amount of talent. The problem is the Georgia standard right now is the playoff standard. We talk about a lot. We talk about you relative to the standard that you want to be at. And to an extent we're negative, it's only because we view you as a playoff team. You're still the most talented team in the East. You're still, either the first or second most talented team in the SEC with Alabama. And even that's a little bit debatable right now. Georgia is still a phenomenal football team. It's just a lot of bad things all coalescing at once that cause us to be a little bearish on the win-loss total.
Yeah, and if you're going to take a step back and have a year where you quote-unquote regress, this is the year you want to do it because you have something that you can point to that isn't in your control in terms of inside your program, that you're not giving fodder for negative recruiting or other people to say, all right, we're going to go out and steal your players or kill you in recruiting because you had this off year. Everybody's going to have off years. It's going to be weird for everybody across the board. So if you want to rebuild and have that kind of step back year, and maybe we're wrong and they don't have it, but if they do, this is the year that you want to have it. All right, y'all, that's it for us on Georgia. Thanks for listening to this one and coming in late with a preview. So we appreciate any eyeballs we might get on this one. Y'all have a great week, and God bless.